Well, we love it when people come on time. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Let people continue coming in as they can. So welcome very much. So excited to see so many of you here. Thank you all for coming. I am Petra Silton, the Director of Advocacy and Education for Thrive, the Alliance of Nonprofits for San Mateo County.
And I am Heather Cleary, CEO of Peninsula Family Service. We are starting today with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that our office and services operate on the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone tribes, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout generations. As organizations that are dedicated to advancing equity, practicing empathy, and understanding each other's differences, we aspire to show appreciation, respect, and concern for all connected to this land. We also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples, and we gratefully recognize our history. Also, we are recording this session today to share with those who registered and were unable to make it live.
We have Spanish interpretation available. Everyone must select the language they wish, even if it's English, from the globe at the bottom of the screen. So go to the bottom of your screen where it says interpretation, click either English or Spanish. Please, for the speakers, speak at a moderate rate to make it easier for the interpreters. Tenemos interpretación en español disponible para los que la necesita. Por favor, localiza el icono del globo en la parte baja de tu pantalla y selecciona español. Has everybody had a chance to select either English or Spanish? Si tienen preguntas, puede preguntar en el chat. So on behalf of Thrive Alliance and Peninsula Family Service, we want to offer you a warm welcome. We would like to thank our sponsors, Silicon Valley Community Foundation and the Grove Foundation, for their support of this series on policing in San Mateo County. We are also grateful to Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center's Executive Director, Melissa Natani Jones, for moderating and being a thought partner. If you would like, please introduce yourselves in chat. And if there are any elected officials in the virtual room, please make sure to note that in chat because we would like to recognize you. I'd like to briefly introduce Thrive Alliance to many of you who may not know us. We are a robust, trusted network of more than 200 nonprofit organizations, government entities, foundations, businesses, community leaders with a shared commitment to strengthening the nonprofit sector and thereby improving the quality of life in San Mateo County. We strengthen people, organizations, and communities through policy and advocacy, through cross-sector convenings, and through nonprofit capacity building. You can learn more about membership in Thrive and our programs at our website. So a national conversation has been taking place about the relationship between law enforcement and diverse, historically marginalized communities. It is unrealistic to expect that San Mateo County could be exempt from the societal influences driving these issues. Thrive Alliance is a trusted network that seeks to create communication and collaboration between nonprofit organizations, government, and the private sector in San Mateo County, has a deep interest in the relationship between law enforcement and the communities that Thrive's members represent. Fundamental to that relationship is good information, a common set of facts on which to base a productive dialogue that can foster collaboration and trust across the community.
Peninsula Family Service is a 71-year-old local nonprofit providing tools and support to over 12,000 community members a year. We have a variety of programs to meet people where they are in life. We serve pregnant moms, children, adults, and older adults with care and education, transportation, employment, technology, financial empowerment, mental health, and more. Our 8 early learning centers serve 450 local families in San Mateo County who are considered low income. Many of these families are houseless, have experienced domestic violence, and do not have secure, stable employment. Today's event is the 7th in our Thought Leader series, where we gather local experts who are our colleagues and partners in making our community a better place for all. I'm proud to be here today with over 150 now, community members to have a conversation on an issue of critical importance, public safety. One of the questions I've received is, why PFS? How does work around police data relate to our mission of providing tools and support so children, families, and older adults can realize their full potential and lead healthy, stable lives? And I have three answers. First, the trauma associated with law enforcement and crime is present in our early learning centers, and it spreads. Trauma is present for our children, for our families, our teachers, our support staff and their families, and beyond. I can only speak for my team, but if it hits PFS so hard, how does it not hit our first responders just as hard? We are all people and none are immune. Second, inequitable treatment of different races or ethnicities divides and weakens community. Our mission and vision at Peninsula Family Service is a strong community where opportunity, stability, and wellness are secured for all. Take a moment and envision a community that is safe for all, where everyone has opportunity, financial stability, and wellness. What does that mean for you? Does an increase in stability correspond with a decrease in crime? Does an increase in wellness decrease mental health crises? Third, I believe to ensure our community is safe for all, we all need to participate, ask questions, and fight for it. Fortunately, we do have tools to work with, some of which you will hear about today. In my role as CEO, I see how the presence of law enforcement can have a negative effect on those we serve. For example, one of our early learning centers became a shelter site after the police arrived for an unrelated traffic accident on the street outside. Parents were scared and they wouldn't leave until the police were gone. While there was no direct interaction, there was trauma that day. At the same time, I value our law enforcement. I appreciate their work, such as when they found the people lighting fires in the middle of the night behind our building on 2nd Avenue in San Mateo. Public safety involves trade-offs. It is a hard balance, one that is the responsibility of all community members and requires good, transparent data to inform decision-making.
I would like to tell you the personal story of how Heather and I got to this point. A year and a half ago, after the George Floyd murder, there were a lot of questions and conversations at my family dinner table. We decided as a family to participate in the Black Lives Matter protest march in the city of San Mateo that was organized by youth groups. The march provided a positive space to express outrage at the national situation and seemed very orderly. At the end of the peaceful march, there was a gathering at the San Mateo police station. Suddenly, 7 to 8 SUVs from the sheriff department and police from other cities came roaring down the street with their sirens blazing, driving uncomfortably fast and uncomfortably close to the protesters, who were standing and sitting peacefully. A large number of officers in full riot gear jumped out of their cars and took positions just a few yards away from where I was standing with my sons. We were frankly scared. It felt like a major escalation of a peaceful situation. All of my previous personal interactions with law enforcement had been positive, and my regard for them was high. This got me thinking. Here was a side of the police I hadn't seen from my privileged vantage point. Is this what policing looks like for other communities in San Mateo? Maybe we can't significantly influence the national conversation, but as an engaged citizen, shouldn't I know what's going on locally? Heather and I are both San Mateo residents of over 20 years. We're concerned about our communities and the communities we serve through our work. And we were searching for ways to understand the national conversation on the local level. We started meeting regularly with some other local San Mateo residents who we knew were also concerned. Sherri Watkins, a San Mateo Foster City School Board trustee, and a parent who was also at the march with her children. And Rick Bonilla, San Mateo City Council member. Soon our meetings were joined by Andrew Skelton, who was born and raised in San Mateo and cares deeply about his community and was, at the time, a year and a half ago, a senior at Stanford and was planning to study racial disparities in arrests for his senior thesis. So we realized the first thing we needed to do was to get data so we could have informed conversations. And that's where we got stuck. All of us are used to looking at data. We're trained to understand it. We're well connected, and we thought we could figure this out. We thought we could get look at the data and get a clear picture of how race and arrests are connected in our county. We were wrong. We spent the last year trying to get that clear picture. Once we realized it was so hard for us to get the clear picture, we knew we had a bigger story to tell that was around two different dimensions. First, the story of the challenges we all faced just to know and agree on the data, the police interactions. And second was how to work with law enforcement to develop and increase constructive ways to make our community safe and fair.
Our goal today is to start a conversation so we can begin to work together to ensure this community is a community designed for all of us to be and feel safe and secure. To ensure that today's event is a safe place for our participants, we were fortunate to bring in a local expert in moderation, Melissa Natani-Jones from PCRC. Melissa was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. In 2006, Melissa joined the Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center team as a volunteer and was hired as a staff member in 2008. Since then, she has held a number of positions within the organization and now serves as the executive director. Melissa is committed to the authentic engagement and collaborative problem solving using a cultural humility lens. She has received numerous awards for her leadership, including the Gil Lopez Award for her work in reducing gang violence on the Peninsula. Melissa is a natural communicator and leader who intentionally listens to others while navigating the many complexities of life, professionally and personally. Take it away, Melissa, and thank you.
Thank you, Heather and Petra. I am honored to participate in our conversation today. Again, my name is Melissa Natani-Jones, and I have the distinct pleasure of serving as the Executive Director at the Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center. PCRC is a 35-year-old neutral third-party nonprofit serving the entire county and beyond by providing services to help individuals with their most complex issues. PCRC is often called on by local leaders, community organizations, government entities, and community residents to facilitate tough conversations. And these conversations are leading towards a shared sense of empathy, accountability, and increased trust. So PCRC is happy to partner with Thrive and Peninsula Family Services on this important conversation. So as I guide us through the process today, I just want to share that I want to remind folks who are joining us that there is Spanish simultaneous interpretation services available. Again, if you missed it in the earlier announcement, please click on the globe and click on Spanish. So if you or anyone that you know on this call needs that service, please feel free to do that. I'm going to just quickly go over our agenda for today. After this, I will review some Zoom etiquette and expectations. We'll have short presentations from two of our guests today, followed by a panel discussion, and then some Q&A from our audience members to our panelists. And then we'll conclude with next steps and close this event by 4 p.m. Just a few Zoom etiquette tips. As we continue to navigate virtual spaces in this new world, I do apologize in advance if there's any challenges. We will try to address them as soon as we can so that it doesn't interrupt the flow of our time together today. I'm also asking that you all mute. There will be opportunities to put questions in the chat for all of you to submit for us to consider asking our panelists today. And so we also invite you to keep your camera on whenever possible. And then of course, please feel free to turn your camera off if you are doing something that might be a little distracting. But ultimately, we'd love to see your face. And again, the use of the chat box. Please be respectful. Attendees, I would love for you to share things that resonate with you today, key ideas, and any action items you'd like to recommend the group today. Before we begin, I'd like to give you all some food for thought. I know that many of you are not new to the topic of community policing or data, but for those of you who are learning and exploring, I'd like to give you some supporting tips. Sometimes when we engage in conversations that are personal to us, reflect our values and principles with, and there's others who don't agree in the same conversation, that sometimes we can feel stuck and we have challenges moving forward. Today is just a step, and this is an opportunity for new understanding, interaction, and learning with those who have different perspectives. And by this, the community is strengthened. So I'd like to encourage you all to think about 3 possible outcomes from our time together. One is institutional and policy impact. Some ideas or even information shared today can be input for decision makers on policy, priorities, and stakeholder processes. Number 2 is collective action. This hopefully can inspire and create new or strengthen existing community partnerships and collaboration toward a shared goal. And finally, individual change. We each can learn and develop new attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs through public participation and where new leaders emerge, which all of you have taken a step towards by being here today. Now I'm going to shift to our presenters. I'd like to introduce both Andrew Skelton, who is a Stanford graduate, who will be sharing a case study of police data. Andrew is a graduate of Stanford University, and we're really excited to hear about some data he's collected and its impact. After that, we'll hear from Magnus of the Public Policy Institute of California, who will share data as well on a more regional and statewide perspective. And so I will first turn it over to you, Andrew.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. So like Melissa said, my name is Andrew, and I'm currently a master's student of sociology at Stanford, and I was born and raised in San Mateo. So today, I really want to talk about 2 things. I'll start out by talking about the process of getting data from the San Mateo Police Department and the San Mateo County Sheriff's Department, and then I'll move on to show you some of the results of our data analysis. So to request the data, I partnered up with Sherri Watkins, Petra Silton, Heather Cleary, and San Mateo Deputy Mayor Rick Bonilla. Getting this data, to say the least, was much harder than it should have been. So for the Sheriff's Department, I submitted a Public Records Act request asking for 5 metrics that we thought would tell us something about what the department is implementing racist institutional practices. And so those metrics were arrests, use of force incidents, stops, 911 dispatches, and transfers to ICE custody. But instead of getting a response from someone in the department, I actually got a letter from the county's legal counsel. So their attorney told me that the Public Records Act actually excludes law enforcement, and therefore they weren't legally obligated to share anything with me. They did send some limited information on ICE transfers, but that was about it. So I went and I touched base with the others, and we decided that Deputy Mayor Bonilla would follow up with them since he had a working relationship with the sheriff and the attorney who had sent the letter. The 3 of them had a separate meeting, after which the sheriff decided he would send us some data on arrests, but nothing else. The attorney informed us that the rest of the data we requested was either not being collected or could not be compiled and sent to us because it would take up too many of the department's resources. So I think it's really important to note here that the department hid behind stipulations of the Public Records Act in order to avoid being completely transparent with this information. And that the process of getting data from the Sheriff's Department only worked in the end because someone in our group has tangible political power and a working relationship with the higher up folks involved. And I think it's important to say that because the Sheriff's Department is a public institution, and ordinary residents of the county should be able to know how they're being policed without needing personal access to empowered elected officials. So now I'll move on to talk about getting data from the San Mateo Police Department, which is a different department from the sheriff. And I also want to point out that SMPD does have a website where you can view some pre-tabulated charts and graphs of their policing activity. But for reasons that I'll discuss later, these charts only provide a surface level glance and don't demonstrate the full depth of the issue. So when we submitted the Public Records Act request to SMPD, we decided to have Deputy Mayor Bonilla submit the request rather than myself. SMPD responded by sending us thousands of pages of data on arrests, use of force incidents, and 911 dispatches. But that data was in PDF format. And so because it was in PDFs, there was no way of using statistical software to make sense of it. And when we asked for the data to be sent in a usable format, we were told by the department that they wanted to keep the data in PDF to, quote, ensure its integrity and remain aware of exactly what was released, end quote. And so a few days later, we got an email from the San Mateo clerk who informed us that the Public Records Act actually requires them to provide data in the requested format if it exists. And so eventually we got usable data because SMPD was legally required to give it to us. But the problems didn't end there. So although we now had the data, all of the listed offense and criminal codes were uninterpretable without a code book, which we didn't get. And there was no information on race or ethnicity for use of force incidents. So we followed up again with the department, asking for the information that was missing. And 2 months after that, they got back to us with some of what we asked for, but we were still missing the raw racial information for use of force incidents, which was really important information given the purpose of this project. And so actually around 2 weeks ago from today, after many more months of emails and meetings, we finally got everything from SMPD we'd asked for. And so in the end, it took over a year to get the data we needed. And so I'll move on to the findings from the data in just a second, but I wanted to spend some time telling the story of how difficult it was for us to even get the data in the first place. And like I said before, these are public institutions that run on taxpayer dollars. So transparency shouldn't be seen as a burden for them. It should be seen as a requirement. And so now we can really get into what this data looks like. So Yahida, can we start sharing? Amazing, thank you. Okay, great. So I also want to just mention before we continue that the data shown today will only include analysis of white, Latinx, and Black folks. Some groups were excluded from analysis because different ethnic and racial groups are marginalized in different ways. Next slide. So I'll start by taking a quick look at the data on use of force incidents that we were sent just 2 weeks ago. Next slide. So this chart shows the racial makeup of San Mateo's population compared to the racial makeup of all SMPD use of force incidents. The green bars indicate each racial group's percentage of San Mateo's population, and the blue bars indicate the percentage that they make up of all SMPD use of force incidents. So here we can see quite clearly that Black and Latinx folks are much more overrepresented in use of force incidents than white folks. But we might also want to consider that not everyone SMPD uses force on is from San Mateo. So we can instead look at the racial makeup of use of force incidents on San Mateo residents. Next slide. So this graph is exactly the same as the previous one, except for the fact that the blue bars now represent the percentage of use of force incidents on San Mateo residents only. So while Black San Mateo residents are now more accurately represented in use of force incidents, the disparity for Latinx residents has actually increased. I'm just going to pause for a second so people can kind of take this in. And so there's a lot more to say about use of force incidents, but as I mentioned earlier, we were only sent this data 2 weeks ago. And so we've had very little time to perform any additional analysis. Next slide. So now we can take a look at some of the arrest data. Next slide. So for most of the arrest data, we'll be visualizing it in the same way that we did for the use of force incidents. This chart shows the racial makeup of San Mateo's population compared to the racial makeup of all SMPD arrests. And just as we saw with the use of force data, Black and Latinx folks are severely overrepresented in SMPD arrests. While Black folks make up only 2% of the population, they make up 11% of all SMPD arrests. And similarly, while Latinx folks make up only 25% of San Mateo's population, they make up 46% of all SMPD arrests. But just as with use of force incidents, we may want to consider that not all SMPD arrestees are from San Mateo. Next slide. So instead, we can compare the racial makeup of San Mateo to the racial makeup of SMPD arrests, only considering the arrestees who live in San Mateo. And although we've changed some of the data, there's hardly any difference in the disparities present. Black and Latinx folks are still overrepresented by over 200% in SMPD arrests. Next slide. And so another way of putting this is that Latinx San Mateans are arrested by SMPD at 3.3 times the rate of white San Mateans. Next slide. And Black San Mateans are arrested by SMPD at 5.2 times the rate of white San Mateans. So we may also want to consider that there may be differences in crime rates between different racial and ethnic groups. So we can then look to arrest disparities for crimes which we know are committed at similar rates by all ethnic and racial groups, nonviolent drug crime. Next slide. So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has found in multiple studies that drug crime is committed by Black, white, and Latinx folks at incredibly similar rates. And I just included a couple of citations here in case if anyone is curious. Next slide. So when we look at arrest rates for drug crime, we should expect to find that white, Black, and Latinx folks are all arrested at the same rate, but this isn't the case. Again, we see that Black and Latinx folks are overrepresented in arrests for crimes that we know they commit at the same rate as white folks do. And so I also want to circle back to the discussion of SMPD's data website here. So although their website shows some pre-tabulated graphs and charts, there's no way to break the information down like this. We can't examine the racial breakdowns of nonviolent drug arrests on their website or compare it to the relevant populations to understand if there are real racial disparities present. And so for cases like this, I think it's so important that we control what we're able to look at with the raw data. And I think that's really what full transparency means. Next slide. And finally, we can take a look at how these arrest percentages have changed over time. So this graph shows change over time horizontally from 2014 to 2020. Each line shows the percentage that each racial group makes up of SMPD arrests. So we have Latinx folks in green, white folks in red, and Black folks in blue. And we can see that since 2014, the percentage of SMPD arrests made up by Latinx folks has actually increased by nearly 20%, while the percentage of SMPD arrests made up by white folks has decreased by 10%. So this data is showing that it's not getting better over time, it's actually getting worse. Next slide. And so none of this is to say that we shouldn't take crime seriously, but maybe we should think a little bit more about the ways we police crime when that policing adversely affects marginalized people and communities. And so if you have any questions about the data presented here today, or maybe some questions about the data that I didn't have time to talk about, please feel free to just email me at askelton@stanford.edu. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And now we'll turn it over to Magnus.
Great. Thank you, Melissa, and thank you all for being here today. I'm really grateful to be part of this event that recognizes that data and research are really needed to inform these important policy discussions in order for us to identify strategies for safely reducing racial disparities. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share some finding from some recent work that we have done at PPIC, where we examine differences across race and ethnicity and their experiences with law enforcement, and particularly using police stop data. And this is a different story from the one that Andrew shared, because we had this possibility of doing this work really as a result of legislation that was passed in 2015 that will eventually mandate that all law enforcement agencies in California collects police stop data. And that is the Racial Identity Profiling Act that was rolled out in 2018. And eventually, as I said, will mandate all law enforcement agencies to collect these kind of data. It's rolled out depending on the size of the agencies. But before I get to that, I think it's worthwhile to put San Mateo and San Mateo County in the context of California more broadly in terms of some of the key criminal justice outcomes like crime, arrest rates, as well as that racial disparity that we heard a little bit from Andrew about that he saw in the San Mateo data. And see how that compares to what's happening and elsewhere in California. And that's stuff that's based on some other previous work that we have done at PPIC. And the first thing is to take a look at the crime rates, because I do think it's important to recognize that what we see in terms of policing and decisions made by police to a very large extent is going to be driven by the public safety environment and crime rates. And what we see there is that San Mateo has some of the lowest violent crime rates in California. It's a relatively safe area. The property crime rate is a little bit below what it is of California more broadly. And then given that we're talking about a relatively safe environment, it's not surprising that the arrest rates are quite low in San Mateo compared to California more broadly. And in fact, if we look at the felony arrest rate, in San Mateo, it is one of the lowest. It was when we looked at this, which is a few years data that is a few years old, it was the second lowest felony arrest rate in California. And what we see that when we look at the misdemeanor arrest rate, it's around what it is for the state. It's a little bit lower, but it is a little bit higher than some of the other counties around the Bay, including San Francisco, Contra Costa, and Santa Clara. So if we then turn to the issue of racial disparity, and if we focus on Black-white disparity, which is in general, when we think about these issues, that is where we see the biggest disparity. What we see then is that in San Mateo, there is very notable racial disparity, that in terms of the arrest rate, it's many times higher, the arrest rate for Black individuals compared to white individuals. The year we looked at, which was 2016, it was eight times higher for Black individuals than it was for white individuals. Statewide, it was around 3 times higher. So disparity was broad in California, but it was especially high here in the Bay Area and including San Mateo. And it was about the, San Francisco and Marin, for example, are almost as high as San Mateo. But I think it's worthwhile to think about, we're focusing here in our discussions, we're talking about policing. And I think it's well worth pointing out that racial disparity isn't limited to policing or arrests. And in fact, when we look at later stages of the criminal justice system, we actually see that the racial disparity is even greater. So for example, while in California, Black individuals make up about 6% of our population, but they're about 16% of all arrests. If we look at the incarcerated population, we see that about 25% of our jail population are Black Californians and 29% of the prison population. In other words, we see very notable racial disparity in the criminal justice system. It's not limited to policing. And in fact, when we think about it, we look at what research has found in terms of racial bias in general, in a number of contexts outside of the criminal justice system, including employment, housing, and financial markets, we see racial bias consistently. So this is not limited to just a criminal justice system or policing. We're talking about something that is prevalent through our communities and society. But turning to our research, which builds on some of this previous work on arrests. And what we're doing here is we're going to use police stop data to examine differences in the experience individuals have in their interactions with law enforcement in terms of searches, enforcement, and different levels of intrusiveness, including use of force. And again, as I said, the findings that I'm going to share with you here, we're going to focus on differences between Black and white individuals. The report that the results are based on, which is available at our website at ppic.org, does include analysis that extends to other racial and ethnic groups as well. The types of experiences that we are examining in this report include the likelihood of being searched, given that you've been stopped. And then we look at, well, given that you've been searched, what is the likelihood that that officer is finding some contraband or evidence? We look at the differences in enforcement, the likelihood of some enforcement taking place during that stop, ranging from there's no enforcement all the way up to that the individual being stopped was arrested and booked into county jail. And lastly, and importantly, we are trying to get a sense of the experiences as measured by some level of intrusiveness. And that can range from anything, assuming that we're talking about a vehicle stop, that the person is being asked to step out of the vehicle, all the way to, let's say that the likelihood of at least being handcuffed, to the use of force involving an officer's weapon. So we're looking at the racial disparity in these types of experiences. And the way that we're doing that is we're using those data from the Racial Identity Profiling Act. And we're going to use the most recent data that are currently available, which is for 2019. And those data are limited to the 15 largest law enforcement agencies in California. That includes the California Highway Patrol. It includes 6 sheriff departments and 8 police departments. In the Bay, that includes San Jose, Oakland, and San Francisco. And what we're trying to do in our work is to recognize that other factors could actually contribute to the disparity that we see in the data. And we want to move towards what we call closer towards an apples to apples comparison. And what I mean by that is that we're recognizing that a stop that's taking place under different contexts is also very likely to play out differently, and that individuals will have different experiences. For example, a stop for a traffic violation might very well be limited to nothing more than verbal communication. If we're talking about a stop that instead is because the individual has an outstanding warrant out for an arrest, that's likely to be a very different experience than that of a traffic violation. If a stop includes the officers actually seeing some contraband, possibly a weapon, again, that experience is going to be different, very likely compared to if none of that is observed. So we're going to use the data to make statistical adjustments using regression techniques to control for those kind of situations. And then we also recognize that jurisdictions face different kind of challenges in terms of their crime levels. They have different policing strategies. We are also going to make adjustments for that. So with that, what I want to do is I'm going to show some of the figures that I think it will give you a sense of what it is that we find in our analysis. I'm going to share my screen here. And let's see here if we can get this up and running. There we go. This is the title of the report from which these results are. It's Racial Disparities in Law Enforcement Stops. So the first figure and results that I want to share is looking at the likelihood of being searched given that you're stopped. And it's about 11% of stops involve a search of the individual or the individual's property. And what we see here is very notable differences in the likelihood of being searched. These bars, I'm going to point towards this first bar here, represent the percentage point difference in the likelihood of being searched between Black and white individuals. And what it's showing is that it's 12 percentage point more likely for a Black individual to be searched than a white individual. Those differences are, it's more than twice as likely that a Black individual is going to be searched compared to a white individual. And then the other bars here represents what happens to that estimated racial disparity once we make adjustment for other personal traits, context, in this case represented by the reason for stop. And then lastly, when we add to all of that as well, the differences in where that particular stop is taking place. And what we see here is that these contexts and factors, they notably contribute to those racial disparities. And they drop from about 12 percentage points down to 4 percentage points. So context, it does matter. But we're still seeing that Black individuals are more likely to be searched than white individuals. Even when we're making these adjustments, we're finding that Black individuals are 1.5 times more likely to be searched compared to white individuals. If we then turn to looking at, well, what are officers finding there? In these searches, are they more likely to find contraband and evidence in searches of Black individuals compared to white individuals? That's what this graph is showing. And in fact, what we see in the data is, given that a search took place, officers are actually a little bit less likely to find contraband and evidence in those searches. It's in about 20% of the searches that officers make, they find some evidence of some contraband or evidence. And so there's a little bit less of a likelihood then that they're going to find that on a Black individual who's being searched compared to a white individual. Again, we're going to make adjustments for various personal factors, as well as different contexts and where the stop is taking place. And what we're seeing is, in fact, that it increases that gap, that Black individuals who are being searched, once we make those adjustments, are 2 percentage points less likely to have been found to have some contraband or evidence on found by the officer. So that's about a 10% difference, and pointing towards, no, you're actually less likely to find contraband or evidence in searches of Black individuals. If we switch to enforcement, we're looking at various levels of enforcement. I'm going to focus here on stops where there is no enforcement. The first thing to recognize is that the vast majority of stops actually involve some level of enforcement. If we define at least being issued a warning as enforcement, that's about 88% of the stops that are included in these 4 million stops that we have information on from 2019. So, and it's about 2/3 of all stop, at least a citation is being issued. But again, we're seeing big differences in enforcement here. And what we see is that in about 20% of stops of Black individuals, there's no enforcement. And that's only about 8% of stops of white individuals. Again, making these adjustments for various factors and contexts, we see that they matter here as well. But still, even when we have made those adjustments, we're still seeing that Black individuals are more likely to be stopped without any enforcement. Yeah.
Are we allowed to ask questions now or make a comment, or shall I wait till you're done?
I think we're going to wait till we're done here.
Okay,
but
no problem.
Okay.
All right, carry on.
All right, I'm going to keep going then. So the last outcome that we want to look at here, that I want to share some findings, are for the intrusiveness. Like I said, we're going to look at the various levels of intrusiveness here, ranging from, assuming that this is a vehicle stop, these data include pedestrian stops as well, that the individual is being asked to step out of the vehicle, to handcuffed, to it actually involving an officer's weapon. And what we see is that for all of these, that Black Californians are more likely than white to experience greater intrusiveness. They are about at least twice as likely to experience one of these measures of intrusiveness compared to white individuals. And again, though, we see that this context matters, and we see a notable drop once we actually make those kind of adjustments. I think it's worthwhile pointing out here, weapon involved is obviously of great concern. Those are relatively rare instances. It's out of those 4 million stops, it's in about 0.4% of those stops that a weapon is involved. That's a little bit fewer than 17,000 stops where a weapon is involved. It doesn't mean that the weapon was fired. That could be that the officer was aiming a weapon at the individual. It's less than 2,000 stops where an actual weapon was used, including a firearm being fired. Lastly, what I want to do is, we recognize that there are big differences in the missions and the roles that the different law enforcement agencies play. And particularly, CHP is primarily tasked with keeping our highways safe. Local law enforcement is more tasked towards the issue of crime and public safety. So these different missions are then likely to also have big impacts in terms of the reasons for the stops, and we certainly see that in the data as well. But it might also be that we have differences in racial disparities across agencies in terms of CHP versus local law enforcement. And the other thing that we saw in these data was that the context matter and the reason for stop. Most stops are for traffic violations. The second most common one are for reasonable suspicion. And what we see in the data is that the black-white gaps are greatest in traffic stops that are made by local law enforcement agencies. And the figure that I'm sharing with you here shows when we break those out, where we have the differences in the likelihood of being searched between Black and white individuals, and the differences in the discovery rate, the likelihood that the officer is going to find some contraband or evidence. And what we see here, the orange graph is for local law enforcement, sheriffs and police departments, whereas the dark one here is for CHP. And what we see here is that the gaps are most notable here for stops that are made for traffic violations by local law enforcement. Here we see about 12, 13 percentage point greater likelihood of being searched in stops made by local law enforcement for traffic violations. And when you look at CHP making stops for traffic violations, that is a much smaller difference. The discovery rate, the likelihood of actually them finding contraband or evidence, is 6 percentage point lower, very notable. We'll see that there is also a disparity when we look at reasonable suspicion. That gap is a little bit less than 10 percentage point, meaning that Black individuals are about 10 percentage point more likely to be searched in a stop for reasonable suspicion by local law enforcement. That's not the case for CHP. That might seem like that's almost as big as it is for traffic violations, but notice that the likelihood of being searched is about 4 times greater if you're stopped for reasonable suspicion compared to a traffic violation. So these differences are actually much more notable when we focus on traffic violations. So what are some of the key takeaways and conclusions based on this work? Well, I think if you put it all together, these findings really support the concerns historically voiced by communities of color about inequities. It shows that. But at the same time, it also shows that some disparities may be driven by officer challenges and responsibilities when making the stops. But I think then if we're looking ahead then with this goal of safely reducing racial disparities, what are some of the conclusions? Well, given that these disparities are most notable in traffic stops that are made by local law enforcement, to what extent can those types of stops be safely reduced? And maybe a particular focus should be on non-moving violation. That includes those for improper display of license plates. That seems to deserve a closer look. And by that, we're not saying don't enforce them. It's a question of, are there alternative enforcement options that are available? And if we can find that, then it's possible that those efforts could reduce risk and injuries to both officers and citizens and reduce racial disparities. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Magnus, for your presentation. I just want to quickly remind folks that Q&A will be after the panel discussion. And if you have any questions, to please put them in the chat, and our support team here will submit them to me to be able to ask our panelists. I'd like to thank our presenters, both Andrew Skelton and Magnus Lofstrom. The information was definitely informative, and data can be very complex, nuanced, and informative. So thank you both for your work. And as mentioned earlier, it's very reflective of the conversations that are happening outside of the Bay Area and nationally. In the last 18 months, PCRC has partnered with local law enforcement and cities to be able to engage in these conversations with this need for change. And so I'm glad that we're all able to be here today to continue those conversations. I want to just remind folks that, what you hear and see today is just a snapshot of real experiences of individuals who are participating today. And so with that said, I want to shift gears to our esteemed panel. So as we're bringing the panels in to be pinned, I'd like to first thank our panelists for joining us this afternoon for such an important topic. You all could have declined the invitation to be here and you didn't. So I recognize that there are different perspectives, stories, experiences that we're all passionate about. So again, I thank you all for being here. Before we begin, I'd like to set some guardrails for our discussion and to be just clear about my role as moderator. My role is to be neutral and help guide the process and the discussion. I'm here to help have a conversation that is both deliberative and intentional as possible. Some additional panel agreements for our discussion today is I ask that we all be respectful, to speak one at a time, assume best intentions and consider new viewpoints and information, listen to understand, speak from your own experience, and it's okay to respectfully disagree. And just quickly to remember our time constraints for today. So panelists, are we all good with those agreements? Quick thumbs up would be great. Nice, okay, thank you. And because of time, I'm asking panelists if you can try to keep your responses within 2 minutes. I know it sounds like I'm asking for the impossible, but just for the sake of time, we also want to leave time for Q&A. And I want to just remind the panelists that this is your conversation. So please talk and listen to each other. And so without further ado, let's go on ahead. And so before we begin, my first question is if you could please introduce yourself and tell us why you're here today. And this is for everyone on our panel. I'll start with Shara, then Chief, Kate, Sheriff, and then Magnus, please. And feel free to unmute.
Thanks so much, Melissa, and hi, everybody. Nice to be here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. My name is Sherri Watkins. I'm a board member for the San Mateo Foster City School District. I also am a founder of a coalition here in San Mateo County focused on law enforcement accountability. Why am I here? For a lot of reasons. I am, I would say the main reason is really thinking about how we ensure that all of our systems are accountable to the people they represent. We will be talking more about data in this conversation and just looked at some data that shows us there is clear bias in law enforcement, as there is in literally every other system. So none of us created these systems, but we all have a responsibility to address it. I come from the space of education, and when we look at our data in our district, there are inequities and clear bias in our educational system as well. But that data is accessible to everyone by subgroup, by grade, by school, by subject, and we're always talking about how well we're serving our students. And it's really important for us to think about that common ground. So really motivated to engage in this conversation. And I think we have a narrative here in this county that we actually don't have a problem, that this happens somewhere else. And I've been really shocked and disappointed at how much apathy and resistance there is here to real change, to asking hard questions, to having transparent data. And I haven't seen that. And so I'm here as I've been situated in similar conversations to begin having those tough conversations and to begin starting from a common ground of saying, we do have a challenge here, and how do we work together to move this system forward? And so looking forward to, again, to continuing this discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shara. Chief?
Good afternoon. Thanks, Melissa. And thanks for having me. I'm here because the conversation continues, as you mentioned. This is a conversation we've been having for some time. For those of you that don't know me, I serve as the Chief of Police for the San Mateo Police Department. I've been here for just under 2 years. I've been in the county for much longer than that. But I'm anxious to participate in the discussion and keep it moving forward. One of my priorities in coming to San Mateo was to focus on openness and transparency. And I think we've made some significant strides, but we're always looking to improve and we're always looking to do better. So I'm hopeful that we gain some some new ideas here on how to better do that. So I look forward to us talking.
Thank you, Chief. Kate?
Hi there, my name is Kate Heister. I am the San Mateo County Director for Fresh Lifelines for Youth, or FLY, and my pronouns are she and her. I am here because FLY aims to dismantle the pipeline to prison in California, and we do that by working alongside young people who are involved in the justice system or at risk of involvement in the justice system. And we've been in San Mateo County for about 15 years. Over 90% of the young people we serve are people of color. And we definitely recognize the dramatic racial inequities these various different points in the system. And we're here to try to figure out how to change those outcomes. And so I'm mostly here to share what we've learned from our young people and in working with our young people and their perspectives on this data.
Thank you, Kate. Sheriff?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you again for inviting me. I look forward to our discussion. I'm here because I'm very much interested in us having this discussion, and I greatly appreciate the presenters, and I thought there were some very valid perspectives that were put forward. Of course, bias exists in law enforcement. As Mr. Lofstrom said, it exists in all of our communities and throughout society. The question is, what do we do about it? And is it an issue just in law enforcement? Of course not. But of course, I'll be the first one to tell you, we're not perfect. We have always room to grow, and we are open to growing and getting better in everything that we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. And Magnus?
Thank you, Melissa. Magnus Lofstrom, I'm Policy Director of Criminal Justice at PPIC. I'm here to share a little bit of the perspective of what we see at the state level, to put things in that kind of context, and also bring a little bit of what I've learned working with criminal justice data over the last decade or so here in California, and hopefully be able to provide some insight from that. But more importantly, I'm here to also learn from what my fellow panelists have to share, as well as your participants as well, your perspectives. I think that is how we move forward, is by listening to each other and hearing what people have, their experiences, and take that in and hopefully make some changes, all for the better.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for your introduction and just sharing quickly why you're here today. And as a few of you have already mentioned, it is important that decisions that are made collectively and informed. And one person cannot make these changes, but that a collective can. And so I'm just curious, and I'd like each of you to answer potentially in the same order. What are your thoughts about the data that was presented? What resonated for you and why? And we'll start with Shara.
I thought you were going to switch up the order a little bit. Give me a minute, but I'll jump in first this time.
Thank you.
I mean, I think for me, the important part about looking at this data at a local level, so both for the city of San Mateo and, then San Mateo County and then the Bay Area in general, it kind of goes back to the why I'm here and what I shared. I think that this highlights personal stories, experiences. This highlights that this is a problem here, despite what we kind of see nationally, that, we see killings of unarmed Black men happening other places, and think that could never happen here. And I think what our data shows us is that could happen here. And, I think that sometimes for people of color in our county, and not just our county, again, as we know, this isn't just a problem that we face here. People share their stories and their experiences and are continuously told that that's not true, or that's not what's happening, or your experience isn't valid, but we're better here and we're transparent here and we do X, Y, or Z here. And it really is kind of the definition of gaslighting. And so, I think what the data shows us is that it is true, and that people's experiences are real, and we have kind of this data to back that up. And so I think I think for me, it's getting us all grounded in a place, starting from a place of where are we now, then we can have the conversation about how we move forward, but being able to say we have bias, there is a problem, how do we move forward? We can start from this place where we're all looking at the same thing, which I think allows us to have a more productive conversation. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy thinking about then what do we do about it? Not necessarily, but at least we're starting from the same place, and we can kind of, I think, put to rest this narrative that it's not an issue here.
Thank you, Shara. So just hearing the acknowledgement of highlighting story and that there is a problem here in San Mateo or in San Mateo County, and really needing ways to really look forward on how to address them. So thank you. Chief?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I learned a lot from both those presentations. Just starting with the data, the access to data portion of it that initiated the conversation. I am disappointed to hear that they found it difficult with our city and our agency. And a lot of that is just a process perspective from us. We get many PRA requests on a very, very regular basis that include vast amount of data. I think Mr. Skelton mentioned he got thousands and thousands of records, and that's probably accurate. A lot of times we don't know the context for why that data is being requested, and that was the case in this instance. And we're always happy to be as accommodating as we can, but having that data rather than, and we get a great deal of Public Records Act requests that just ask for raw data, and we don't know what the intent is, but we're happy to provide it, and we just provide it in that form. So if we can do something better there, we'd absolutely like to, and I'm sorry that they found that difficult, but we do our best to comply with that act. And I think in this case, we released everything that we had, not knowing what its intent or purpose was. So we look forward to being better at that moving forward. But as far as the data itself, I think it's a great start. I think it kind of scratches the surface on what we're talking about. There was mention a couple times of our transparency page here at the San Mateo Police Department, which is a new thing for us. Again, I'm new here, and I really had a focus on openness and transparency when I arrived. And we did create the transparency page that was mentioned earlier, and I think it includes variables that we haven't considered yet today. Not to say that the variables that we're talking about are important, but we're talking about race. There's also other, from a law enforcement perspective, when we're measuring or trying to evaluate that data, we're looking at issues like, was this an instance that was self-initiated by the officer, or was it a call for service we're responding to from a resident? What's the age, what's the location, what are the circumstances, and what is the type of crime or activity involved? So I would encourage, I'm glad that we have so many people on this call, because I hope that we see the visits to our transparency page jump tremendously. But just some quick things that we provide, and I think it's a pretty interactive and user friendly page that can kind of let you surf through there and garner some of the information that we're talking about today. Granted, as Mr. Skelton stated, we don't provide it in Excel spreadsheet or raw data format, because we wouldn't have an audience. Nobody would pay attention to what we have. So we try to present it in a format that makes it easy for folks to understand. So just a couple of things there is just we try to articulate what type of calls we receive from residents on a daily basis, what the volume of those calls look like, what are the type of calls, where do they occur, all those types of things. Then we compare that to officer-initiated calls for service, that the officers are observing some type of violation or infraction, and what those two look like. And then you can kind of delve into the police reports that we take, and what those look like as far as some of the information that we're talking about here. We open up internal investigations to let you know when we do receive complaints, how many of those complaints are received from the public, and how many violations do we identify that we're committing internally. And we kind of give a snapshot of what the types of violations we're looking at, what the number of those violations are, so people get a feel for how we're monitoring how we're doing on a regular basis. And then we talked about use of force. I like our use of force page. It gives it breaks it down, and again, it goes far beyond the demographic groups that we talked about today, as far other ethnicities, age, gender, all of those types of things. I think the couple things to point out is, use of force can be defined in many different ways. And I think that the way we track instances regarding force is a big determination on how we evaluate the data. For example, in our instance now, the last time I checked our page, I think we're for every our percentage of interactions with individuals and the use of force is at, I think it's 1/100% where there's force actually used. But what type of force is used? And I think that we're all used to watching cops on TV and seeing all these kind of crazy scenes with people chasing around and stuff. And I'll say over 90% of the documented uses of force that we document are simply, us grabbing somebody's arm who may, we may have to put handcuffs on that may not want to go along with the program. It's not like a full-fledged type of big fight like you would imagine. So, but we're very strict and we're very conscientious about how we document force. That may be different from agency to agency. So I think that struck me from a data perspective. And then a lot was, Mr. Skelton had mentioned the comparison between those that we arrest that may visit our jurisdiction as opposed to residents. I think that's true also of his final slide with or one of the final slides with when it talked about narcotics arrests or nonviolent arrests. A couple things there that are.
Chief, if I can, I just want to kind of wrap up. I hear your response and I also want to give time to everyone else, Chief. Okay. But I just want to point out a few things you talked about, really that the process of a call is really nuanced. And so sometimes data may not fully explicitly share what that looks like, and that the access to data is a process as well and does take some time. You are the PD is very interested and mindful of the context of why these requests come in. And so some of the points that were mentioned earlier, you mentioned are a good start. So I want to go ahead and shift. Kate, just share some of your thoughts, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So kind of bringing it back to what Sherri was talking about and really hopefully that we're all talking about specifically the impact of racial bias in policing. And yes, it is pervasive. Racial bias is pervasive in our society. And I think it's worthwhile for us to all acknowledge that. I think the specific piece from our point of view is that the racial bias that exists in the justice system, in policing and throughout the justice system has a particularly devastating effect on communities of color. And so their urgency is in this space. So that's, I just want to kind of bring it back into that kind of thinking. Broadly, as far as the data, this is very much in line with what we see in our own work and with what our young people share with us. So it is mostly, again, in the demographics of who's incarcerated in this county, who's arrested in this county. These are things that we can see kind of coming up locally that we now have the data to kind of show broadly, but then also the specific experiences. Our young people say things like, I can't even remember the first time I had contact with the police. I can't imagine not having contact with them. They're on my block every day. We're always getting questions, always being asked, what are you doing? Where are you going? They're always on us. And then aside from the over-policing of these communities of color, they explicitly notice their racial disparities in policing. Just recently, one of our youth said, my skin is a crime. And one of our alumni recalled, when I was in school, I saw cops nonstop. I felt singled out and harassed. Whenever I got in trouble for little stuff, I'd be sent to the cop in the office, but I never saw the cop when there were white kids. So I asked about it. And they said it was because the cop was for kids who needed more resources. They acted like this was normal. So I just want to read those because this is our young people's experience, and it has been our young people's experience for many years. So I'm happy that we're getting the data that reinforces this, but it's tough for us to continuously hear this and still have people believe that this is not an actual issue. So I'm really happy that we're able to be in this space and talking about it because I think it really it lends weight to what we hear from our young people.
Thank you so much, Kate. So really sharing the perspective of our young people and what you're hearing. So it does sound like the data that was presented earlier is really aligned with what you've been hearing from the young people and specifically some experiences that you were able to share with us. Thank you. Sheriff?
What was the question again? It's been some time. I'm kidding. I got it.
Oh,
yeah. So I thought the data was good. I mean, I haven't seen, data from Mr. Skelton before, but thank him for his. Of course, I'm very familiar with PPIC and their data. And the data tells us, it tells us what? It doesn't tell us the why, what's behind it. I think it's easy to jump to a conclusion that that the data automatically assumes the worst, or that there's a conclusion there, and I think there's always more to it. I'm familiar with the PPIC data because I was interviewed about it by Half Moon Bay Review, and they wanted me to come to a conclusion, which I wasn't going to do, and I don't think I'm able to do that. But I would just caution all of us to not jump to a conclusion, good, bad, or indifferent, without understanding truly why. Is there bias? I've already said that. Of course there is. Does the bias automatically explain the data? I don't think anybody can scientifically say that. And I also look at data all the time as it relates to my organization, and for our incarceration rates by gender, I typically it's 1,000 male inmates, 100 female inmates. Now, if I were to use the worst possible conclusion, someone might think that we're focusing on males, or worse yet, the females, we're not arresting them because maybe we like them better. I don't know, but I think data requires much more analysis before I believe that we should just jump to the worst possible conclusion. And I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. So you are familiar with the work of PPIC, and that there's more to the data, is what you're saying, and for folks to automatically not assume the worst, but that there is more information needed to support the data and what it says. So perfect question, Magnus, take it away.
Great, thank you. Well, I think it's, what we heard from every panelist here is that there's a great degree of complexity and nuances in the experiences individuals have in their interactions with law enforcement or their criminal justice system. I think there's no doubt about that. And it is also not realistic to think that data will capture every single nuance and complexity that is there. It is important that we recognize what the shortcomings are as we are investigating the issues we're dealing with, and not assume away or biases, or assume that there are biases to a certain degree. Let the data speak to it, but be aware of what those shortcomings are and how they might actually play into what is really happening. So be a little bit careful. Yes, I agree with that. I don't think that we can really move forward in discussions and improvements, increase trust, reduced racial disparity, and improve public safety without using data to inform those discussions. It is with shortcomings and everything. They are there. It is far better than relying on anecdotes and strong reactions to certain situations. So I think data is key for us to move forward. And I think importantly, as much as we've heard some real challenges in getting some data, I think California is really at the forefront of collecting police stop data. There's no other state that has a broader mandate than we have with the Racial Identity Profiling Act than here in California. So there is, it is being rolled out. It is currently only capturing large law enforcement agencies for a short period of time. But as we move forward, those data are likely to help these kind of discussions to inform at least what the data are pointing towards. And even in the basic work that we've done here, I think it's pointing us towards in some directions where we really should have discussions. Traffic violation stops for traffic violations, maybe for non-moving violations, as I mentioned. From everyone's perspective, and including law enforcement, every time an officer is making a stop, he doesn't know what he's in for, or she doesn't know what's going to be happening next. There are risks involved So if there are ways that we can reduce those interactions and stops, not only could we improve safety of officers, but citizens, but possibly reduce racial disparity. It is worthwhile having conversations about alternative enforcement, like I mentioned, for improper display of license plates. That's 200,000 stops out of those 4 million that were looked at. That's 5%. And maybe many of those can't be enforced differently, but certainly worthwhile having a discussion about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Magnus. I'm going to move on to our next question.
Melissa, can I just
yes.
jump in with one thing really quickly? I know.
Please, Sherri. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to, one thing that this kind of brought up, or that I wanted to share is, the data, I feel like, really needs to be driving this work. And so, one of the things I think that came up for me too in looking at this data is, why is this new and why are we only looking at this now? When I think about the comparison to the education system, right, when our educators are looking at their data on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual basis, and they're using that to think about who they're not serving and how they can better serve them. And our law enforcement should be doing the same thing, right? So this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. And, when I think about Sheriff Bolanos kind of saying, oh, this doesn't tell us the why, that should be the work that the sheriff's department, that our police officer departments are doing, right? Looking at this data and determining why and determining how to make it better. And so I just kind of wanted to highlight that this shouldn't be something that's kind of being brought to these organizations or being required by law. It really is best practice to use data to make decisions. And so why aren't we doing that in the system?
Thank you, Shara. So because we've been talking about data, I want to ask, anyone is open, but I would also like to highlight both Chief and Sheriff on this question is, I've heard you, Sheriff, mention that, the why is not mentioned. So to the both of you and anyone else on the panel, what is the data not telling us? What is, in your opinion, what is missing from the data?
I guess I'll go ahead and get started. It doesn't tell me exactly, why the data is what it is. I mean, we know that in law enforcement, we're out there, we get calls for service. There's some self-initiated activities. As Mr. Lofton said, there's traffic stops. It doesn't tell us why the numbers are what they are. And again, I don't think we can just conclude that it's because there's racist policing practices. I personally don't buy that narrative. As I said, bias exists in policing as it does in everything else. The universe that we operate in, for example, in my correctional facilities, half of the people that are in there are not from our county. So I think the moment we start trying to compare apples to apples with data, it becomes a little problematic. So I think, as I said, and I agree with Ms. Watkins, I think we do need to dig deeper into the data, which we will be able to do after RIPA becomes effective for us January 1st. And we have good data that we can look at and examine those disparities and try to understand what's happening and what we need to do to try to correct those disparities.
Thanks, Melissa, for the question. I have a few thoughts and a little bit of a different take on the why. I also have a why question, but I think if I like to step back and take a little bit more holistic kind of view of what we're talking about. And sometimes I believe that, and granted, I think everybody acknowledges, just like every other field, there's bias in policing, just like every other field that we've mentioned here today. But I think I feel like we're jumping into this conversation midstream in many cases, and meaning that we're starting at the point where law enforcement has contact with certain communities or certain ethnic groups. And I think the bigger question is, and it's an age-old question, but the more, why does that happen? Is it solely due to the practices of policing, or is there a larger socioeconomic issue that we're dealing with or have failed to deal with adequately that causes that higher interaction between law enforcement and the communities that we're talking about? I would suspect that they both play a role in what we're talking about here. And I think the difficulty is we're starting at the level of policing. And I think I think it goes beyond that. I think that we work in environments where we don't have control over other variables. And I'm not sure whether that's what the sheriff was referring to, but I think that I'd like to take a look at, granted that acknowledging that there's bias and we have to combat bias within our field. I also think it's important to take a look for us to take a look at a step back as a society and take a look at, hey, are there other considerations as to why we're seeing the numbers that we're seeing? And I would suspect that there are. And so I think that's I think that would be important. And I think that to Trustee Watkins' point, I mean, I'm a big data person, and I know I'm really trying to publicize our transparency page and look for suggestions on how to make that better. But I think that's a step. If we do that, not just in law enforcement, but we do that in other fields, and maybe compare and contrast across disciplines or across fields to see whether there are consistencies or are there issues where we don't see consistent numbers there. I think that might be helpful in moving forward and really looking at this in a comprehensive way rather than just trying to piecemeal it for education, law enforcement, whatever we're talking about. I think that it's an issue that impacts us all, and I think we have to treat it as such.
I want to just give a quick opportunity. Anyone else on the panel want to talk about what potentially the data is not telling us? Or not, it's fine too. Kate?
I mean, certainly I will return to what the lived experience means for young people and for people of color broadly in this community. So I admit to being a little bit disappointed that the response saying, yes, there's racial bias, but maybe that's not real, right? And maybe that's not having a real impact on our communities. That's hard for me to hear because the lived experience of the young people that I know, it is real. And this is really having a big impact on them. And so, for example, a young person said to me, at the end of the day, you can know all of your rights and it doesn't matter. They have the gun, they have the badge, they have the power. They don't care if they're wrong. You're supposed to know your place with them. And so I give you that point because I hear the law enforcement folks here saying, yes, there's racial bias, but maybe it's not real, or maybe it's not apples to apples, or maybe sort of all of these other, and yes, certainly there are broad community issues that we all are need to contribute to solving that may be contributing to some of these patterns. But to say that, to kind of deflect the focus from what can we be doing within law enforcement and within the justice system sort of misses the point from my point of view. So that's, I would hope that we can move back into how can we address the problem within this space and within this sort of realm of the issue, and not deny that there are issues in other realms, but that to say, yes, there's something we need to do here. So that's my response.
And I'll jump in and echo what Kate just shared. And, I know there was conversation from Chief Barberini around kind of this idea that there's other considerations and other systems that are impact. Of course there are, but we each have to look at our individual systems and think about the work that we have to do within those systems. And, I think, I talked a little bit about kind of as people share their experience and perspective, we say we want to be transparent and we want to hear it, but we also turn around in the next sentence and say, but we don't actually think that what you're saying is true, and we don't actually think they're biased. And so, we cannot begin to build trust and build real transparency if that's how we're responding to people sharing what their lived experience is. I think about my role on the board, and then, for example, we have huge disparities in the way that we're servicing our special education students, right? So when I have parents that reach out to me and want to talk about the experience that their students with special needs are having in our district, and thinking about, having a parent sit with me and basically telling them that that's not true. We have all of these great special education programs to service your student, and what you're experiencing, essentially telling them that what they're experiencing isn't true. I can't imagine doing that in that situation, right? We have to start, yes, we do have work to do in this system, and what do we need to do, and whether it's collaboratively, or what can I do as a board member, or what's the role of my superintendent or a special education director? Whose role is it to work on this? And does that mean that I have a solution immediately? No, but I'm definitely not going to sit in a conversation with someone in that situation and tell them that what they're experiencing isn't true, and that their child isn't having the challenge that they're having, or that they're not having the challenge that they're having. Or maybe it's because the system doesn't support students with special needs, right? Like, that's not the conversation that I'm going to have with them in that moment. And so I just think, to Kate's point, if we're going to actually move these conversations forward and actually show people that are impacted by these systems that we really want transparency and we really want to hear them, we have to start by, what I would have loved to hear in response to this is the data that I feel like is missing, and here's what our department is going to do to make sure that we get that data to the community, because I know that you want it. And that's not what we heard. And that's not what we've heard over the past year and a half that we've been having this conversation, or longer, that we've been having these conversations. So I would say that I too feel disappointed in that response.
Well, I'll say it again, and I think Chief Barberini said it as well. We are going to have the data. We're going to present it to you. We will look to make any changes that we need to make. And I know Chief Barberini, and I'll tell you, we'll look at it very, very seriously. I didn't think the idea was to all of us try to say the same thing and necessarily try to agree with each other, but to really be open to each other's perspectives. And I think I'm certainly open to yours, and I would just ask you to be open to mine. I'm a person of color, in case hopefully my picture's up there. Grew up in San Francisco, had many interactions with police. Not all positive. I bear responsibility for some of that. And in my 42 years in law enforcement, I have always ensured and pushed to ensure that we treat everybody with dignity and respect, regardless of their, race, sex, or orientation, or anything else. So I just think it's important that we go back to the initial comment from Melissa, and let's not react to what we're listening to, but be open to the other person's perspective, because I'm open to yours.
Thank you.
Just to echo that, Melissa, I just want to make sure that I've understood. I did in no way want to imply that the data wasn't real, or that this wasn't a real issue. I'm just here to kind of fall on the sword and say we can't do it by ourselves. We need partnerships with the community. We need partnerships with other stakeholders to effectively address this issue. We're very aggressive and proactive in pushing data forward. If there's data there that we're not putting out that we need to, the only way that we're going to determine that is through communication and being able to collaborate with those who we need to collaborate with. So I just want to make sure that I wasn't misunderstood. That I get it. I understand where we're at and what we're trying to solve here. I'm just of the opinion that not just our department, that law enforcement can't do this on their own and solve this issue unilaterally. I think it needs to be a collaborative effort.
I just want to state some things that I'm hearing. I'm definitely hearing that, both Shar and Kate mentioned that they did feel that some of these experience and the data and some of the stories behind the data was not validated. Both Chief and Sheriff have also said that they did not want that to be what was implicated, and have made commitments to really look at the data and try to make some of these changes in collaboration with others, not just the folks on this call, and that they're all different perspectives and different experiences, and we all are trying to interpret the data. And so I do know that that's challenged, and I do again thank you all for trying to stick with us in this conversation. We are running out of time, and so just for the record, we know that RIPA, which is the Racial and Identity Profiling Act, is coming to San Mateo County. The purpose of the RIPA is to eliminate racial and identity profiling, improve diversity and racial identity sensitivity in law enforcement. And so though that's getting ready to happen, you've heard it several times throughout this call. But what I want to do is I just don't want us to talk about the data and the way that we're interpreting it and our experiences, but I really want to talk about how can we move this discussion. And Shara had mentioned, moving forward, Chief Barberini, all of you have mentioned at some extent about how can we move forward from what the data is currently telling us. So my question is, how can police and community work together to create more collaboration? And what does that look like? So we know that the data is telling us something right now. And how do we want to shift the data so that it tells us something different in 3 to 5 years? What are some of those things that we need to do in order to see that happen? So that is open to anyone, hoping someone from law enforcement. I know that several of you have already mentioned a few things that you would like to see. But again, I want to pose the question about how does police and community work together to create more collaboration to change the future?
Well, I think it's about continuing to build a relationship with the communities that we serve. For the Sheriff's Activities League, we do that through the Sheriff's Activities. At the Sheriff's Office, we do it through the Sheriff's Activities League, focusing on the youth in our community and building that relationship of trust at an early age. Hopefully that's being reinforced at home by their parents. Secondly, we have the Care On program, which was designed, many years ago to really develop that relationship with our immigrant communities, and many of whom come from countries where their trust of law enforcement is not high, and by trying to provide service and creating that relationship, we want to build better communities. It's really about communities getting to know us as just human beings, and us getting out into the community and listening to what their fears and concerns are and trying to address those.
Thank you.
I would echo a little bit of what the sheriff says. I do think that the youth component is an important one. Our mission here at San Mateo PD is to do whatever we can to keep young people from entering the criminal justice system. We've had a long time partnership with San Mateo County Probation that gave us an alternative to submitting low-level criminal cases committed by juveniles to the DA or to the court system, and developing other programs and diverting those cases. So those young people we all know what happens when you get involved in the criminal justice system. Sometimes it's really tough to get out. It's a difficult cycle. We work with families and we've expanded that from diverting those who have been in trouble to a prevention program where, if there are signs, we can get referrals from officers who develop relationships in the field with families that they're concerned about, or young people that they're concerned about, and we offer those resources up. And I think countywide we've been pretty successful with that, given the lack of population at our juvenile facility, which is I'm told is dwindling. And so I think that that's an encouraging sign. I think that other efforts are important as far as public outreach goes. As you know, Melissa, I think you've facilitated a couple of them for us. Every other month or so, we do a Real Talk San Mateo series where we solicit subject matter or items from the public, and we kind of open up the discussion and make ourselves vulnerable, which I think is it has served us pretty well. And then there's other small programs that many police departments do. We recently completed our Community Police Academy, where we had people who had very diverse views of law enforcement and had varied interactions with law enforcement, and we kind of open up the doors, and we really don't have a whole lot of secrets. And I think that we're not there to change anybody's mind, and we're not there to do any kind of recruiting or PR project. We just want to familiarize people with what we do and what we're about, and how much our genuine care for the community and what we see our role as being, and a lot of that is dictated by the needs and wants of those that we serve. And I think that those have gone a long way in building a strong. We're fortunate, as Mr. Lofstrom mentioned, we're fortunate to live and work in a safe, very safe environment compared to some others. And I think a lot of that is due to the relationship that many of our local law enforcement agencies have with the communities. Not to say that there's still not a lot of work to be done, but I think we all recognize that as being a very important part of this whole process.
Thanks, Chief. Kate or Shara, and Magnus.
Jump in for a minute. You know, I think I've said a lot about kind of building trust and building relationships and listening authentically. I actually will say that those responses demonstrate that not happening, because I think what the question was is, what do we do differently? And I think both of you shared what you're already doing, and we're seeing in chat after chat, and we hear, you know, at various meetings and comment after comment, right, that's not working for everyone, and that's actually not building trust. And so what do we do differently, and how do we, you know, I think there's a lot of, sometimes we're asking people to come to the table that have been impacted or that are being oppressed, or, you know, that are in marginalized groups. And that's actually not their responsibility, right? If they want to, but it's our responsibility to make changes so that that we start to build those bridges and that we start to build trust. That's on us, right? In the education system, that's on me as an educator, or me as a board member, or me as a superintendent, to show people that we are not servicing well, that I'm going to do something differently to ensure that their kids' experience is going to be different than it was before I was there, right? And if I'm not doing that, then that's on me. It's not on them to make those adjustments. And so I think that narrative and perspective and way that we're thinking about how we're solving this problem really has to shift. You know, I think I'll just speak for myself. I've been questioning systems for a long time, much before I was engaged in this work, you know, and law enforcement is no different, right? With the exception of the ability to both take and save lives. And I think, you know, for whatever reason, it's very unpopular and unsafe to question law enforcement. When we removed SROs from our school board, I was personally threatened and harassed for months following that, right? So speaking out about law enforcement and making adjustments to how we're engaging with law enforcement is, it is really challenging. And so, you know, again, kind of going back to this, it's on you as leading law enforcement and allies in this work to make those adjustments and to make it okay to question the system, make it okay to have these conversations, make it okay for people to say what's not working for them, and to really show both in words and in actions that we're going to do something different, and that we're actually going to hear those perspectives. And that's how you start to build trust. And it's not going to happen overnight. And it's not going to happen through the programs that aren't working currently, right? Like, that's fine to continue doing them, but that's not going to change it because it's not currently changing it.
Thank you, Shara. Kate and Magnus, really quickly.
Yeah. So I certainly agree with Shara. I kind of want to bring it back to Chief Barberini's comment that it can't be done alone. And I want to push on that idea of that really, if you look at some other communities, they are stepping back from this idea that public safety should be led by law enforcement, and are really reconsidering how resources are being deployed in order to build a really holistic idea of public safety. That moves resources from the punishment of crime into trying to address root causes. And so looking at, for example, what's happening in Oakland, what's happening in Sacramento, as examples of engaging the community in rethinking really who should be leading this work, how those resources should be deployed, so that we're not just punishing the symptoms, we are addressing the root causes. So that's really where I would say that, you know, we as a whole community, yes, I agree. This can't solely be done by law enforcement, and perhaps shouldn't even be led necessarily by law enforcement if we want to build a holistic sense of public safety. And that is a way of engaging people who have been, you know, disproportionately impacted by law enforcement specifically, to engage them in this work in a way that really honors their experiences.
Thanks, Kate. Really quickly, Magnus.
Well, I think, yeah, I think part of this is recognizing if we really want to see improvements here in the kind of experiences that we're talking about here. I think it's going to require efforts outside of the criminal justice system. It is recognizing we're dealing with a broader issue here. And to some extent, what we're seeing within the criminal justice system, whether it's policing or other parts of that system, is more of a symptom of the broader problems. If we're really going to solve it, we have to look outside as well. And that doesn't mean that let's not tackle things within the criminal justice system. We should use data that points us in the direction of where we can see improvement as well. But I do think it's a broader issue that if we want meaningful solutions and improvements here, we have to go beyond looking at the criminal justice system.
Great. Thank you so much. So that I would love to sort of reflect some of the things I heard, but for the sake of time, I just want to thank our panelists for joining us. This conversation is one that is just one step towards actual change, and I appreciate all of the perspectives and information shared. Ultimately, I think that there is some movement towards collaboration and making some necessary changes so that we can see the needle move a little bit towards continuous public safety and equity in the way that there's policing. So I'm going to shift it. I just want to say yes to all of you. I see the chat is blowing up and I didn't suspect anything different. However, for Q&A, we're going to spend just about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, if I can push it a little bit, for some Q&A for all of you who are in the audience. Questions are to be submitted through chat. Nobody's going to be unmiking, unfortunately, and I will be asking the questions. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to ask this one particular question. There are a lot of questions about the treatment of youth by police, such as gang member registrations. How can we measure the unapproved inclusion of minor children's driver's license, I believe, and pictures in their suspect gang member database after non-moving traffic violations? So I think that's towards law enforcement. So how can we measure the unapproved inclusion of minor children's DL and pictures in their suspect gang member database after non-moving traffic violations? Oh yeah, that is driver's license.
I'm not familiar with the database that is being referred to.
Okay.
Sheriff, do you know? Maybe I'm missing it.
I don't actually understand the question. I think somebody has a problem with youth being stopped and then their photographs taken and included in some gang file, but I'm not aware of one, so don't really understand that question.
Okay. Here is a question. How do you define success in policing?
Well, that's a nice, easy question. Why don't I take that one, Ed? You know, I don't know how we define success in policing. I think, but I'll try. I think what it is, I think it's a community that is safe, while at the same time, a community that feels safe and that has a good relationship with their law enforcement. I think that's success. I think an unsafe community doesn't feel good. That's not success. And a community that doesn't have faith and a good relationship with the law enforcement agencies that serve them, that's not success.
I would echo a lot of what the sheriff said. I mean, safety and security are our primary mission. I mean, that's why we exist. We are here to make sure that people can go to sleep at night and feel relatively comfortable in their homes and their communities, and that they're not going to be threatened with any type of violence, and that their property is relatively safe. I mean, that's our core mission. In order to achieve that level of success, I think we need to have that communication and relationship with the community, not only for the sake of everybody feeling good about themselves, but for an efficiency purpose. Well, I recognize that we can't achieve that level of safety and security without the help of those that we serve. So I think that in addition to it, that relationship being stronger, which is great, but it also makes us better at what we do when we have those open lines of communication and that level of trust.
Okay. There are a few questions here. Chief and Sheriff, would you please provide the racial, ethnic, gender breakout of your officers and how those statistics compare to the city of San Mateo and county as a whole? So is there a place where this information is available, is I think what they're asking.
Yes, that's available. Well, for the San Mateo Police Department, it is available on our webpage. We provide everything, age, gender, I think religion, sexual preference, connection to the community. All of that is laid out on our transparency page, and I think we compare it to census data. And again, we're always striving. We're never perfect, but we're trying to make sure that we represent as best we can the communities that we serve. So that is available today if you want to look that up.
Great. On the RIPA, when does the sheriff plan to publish the first report?
Our first report is not, I'll tell you right now.
Why not now? And can you commit to the 31st of 2022?
31st of, well, yeah, actually, based on our size, we began collecting the data January 1. Our first round of annual reports are due on April 1st, 2023. However, our intent is to begin reporting to the state concurrent with our collection. And there was another question on the chat about, it said, do I admire Chief Barberini for attempting to make his website more transparent? Admire is a strong word, but we are also working on developing our own transparency website. And so we will post the RIPA data there, as well as our department demographics.
Okay, great. So there has been some data that was requested by both Andrew Skelton and the Deputy Mayor Bonilla, and wondering if this information or the data will be given. Oh, sorry, for the sheriff. Will the sheriff's office provide the data that Andrew Skelton and Deputy Mayor Bonilla requested that was previously denied?
You know, I'll have either one of them can reach out to me directly and ask me specifically what they're looking for. If we have the data and we can legally provide it, then the answer is yes. If we don't have the data, you know, according to the Public Records Act request, we're not required to go out and gather data. But if we have it and it's legal to give to them, of course we will.
Okay, great.
Can I reinforce what the sheriff said there? We are also happy to provide any data, but to the sheriff's point, I don't think we don't have a San Francisco or Oakland or San Jose Police Department in our county where we have large statistical or large groups of statistical personnel or analytical personnel that are able to do a lot of that work. When we get a Public Records Act request, a lot of the reason we're providing raw data is just a capacity issue for us. We get so many requests and there's so much data requested that if you do request data, just from our perspective at the San Mateo Police Department, if you could provide a little bit of context, it may be able to be more useful. If you kind of tell us why you need it, maybe we can reach out to you and work with you a little bit. But we do get requests on a regular basis that we just simply comply with, not knowing what that data is being requested for. And I sense that causes some frustration that I'd like to try to overcome if we can.
Thank you. As you saw, Magnus had to leave the call. And I think I'll just ask one more question. Has the pandemic brought to either the chief or the sheriff's attention areas of concern within their departments?
Well, for me, the biggest area of concern was our jails, our correctional facilities, and the fact that we had individuals there who were vulnerable to the pandemic, as well as my people who, as well as the chiefs. You know, when the pandemic happened, you everybody got to go home. Not everybody, but mostly everybody. But not the men and women of law enforcement who were either out in the field protecting us or in the correctional facility watching our incarcerated population. But I consider ourselves very fortunate that we had no serious illness or death in our correctional facility, but I was worried about our people in there.
My concern, I don't know, we have short memories as communities sometimes. And I remember back in March of 2019, when this first came out and the lockdown came out, we anticipated that there could be some type of panic or civil unrest. And to the sheriff's point, well, most people, we asked them to go home and stay there. We actually asked our folks to do more. And they did it without a second thought, which, made me proud of what I do, obviously. There was a cycle that kind of changed the crimes that we saw into what a little bit of what we talked about here today. And what we haven't talked about, which I also think are significant barriers, are mental health related calls, substance abuse related calls. We saw those kind of become more frequent and more of an issue for us. And we're taking some unique steps to be more prepared to deal with those types of calls. I sense that we're slowly getting back to normal, but I did notice a difference in the types of calls that we were responding to and the frequency of those calls.
Okay. Well, that is the conclusion of our Q&A. I want to apologize to our audience if I did not get to your question. But as mentioned, this is being recorded. And so that includes our chat box. So any of these questions, we will elevate to those they are for, with the hope that there will be a response. Again, I want to thank the panelists. This conversation is not easy, and every time I facilitate them, it doesn't disappoint to be challenging. But I do want to respectfully thank you all for coming. Again, as I mentioned, you didn't have to. And so this is part of how we move the needle. And a mentor once told me that when we think about complicated situations that we want to change, we think of it as laundry. And what I mean by that is that laundry goes into the washer. It goes through several cycles, the rinse, the pre-wash, the wash, and then rinsing again. And that the end of the cycle, it comes out clean. And so your participation today is part of that cycle. So again, I thank you. Thank you for allowing PCRC to be a part of today's event. And I'm now going to turn it over to Petra and Heather for our conclusion this afternoon. Thank you all very much.
So, wow, that was a really amazing panel and an amazing amount of conversation that was being brought forth. And I'm going to go with the laundry analogy for a little bit longer because I really like that. Laundry is also something that's never done. You put it all in, once it comes out clean, by that time there's more dirty laundry. So we realize that this is just the first part of the discussion, and we need to continue with that. We hope that you can all join us for the second part of the discussion. It would be really helpful for us if you could fill out the survey that we're about to put into chat, because among other things, we're going to be asking some of the most important things that you would like to see in our follow-up conversation. So please do, we will also email you that survey, but if you have time to take it now, that's even better. There was so much that we didn't have a chance to cover. And I want to acknowledge all of the important information that was in the chat and everything that people shared. Just to let you know that unfortunately 2 hours is just 2 hours. And we appreciate that you stuck with us for 2 hours, and we will, like I said, continue the conversation. So hopefully we can get to more of those things. So in the follow-up email, you'll receive the recording, you'll receive the slides, and also an invitation to the second part of the series. And your responses to our survey would be super helpful again. So Heather will close us out with next steps. And Heather, thank you so much for your partnership in this 1.5 year journey that, like laundry, is never going to be done.
Well, thank you, Petra, and thanks for everyone who supported this at Thrive and at Peninsula Family Service. Thank you, Melissa Natani-Jones, our amazing moderator, our presenters, Andrew Skelton, Magnus Lofstrom, our panelists, Chief Barberini, Sheriff Bolanos, Sherri Watkins, and Kate Heister, and our partner, Rick Bonilla. Thank you, attendant audience, for attending, engaging, chatting up a storm, asking questions, and spending your time with us. Today's event was about data and highlighting the challenges in getting, interpreting, and developing agreement on data. Part 2 of this event will be in late February, where we will talk more deeply about the impact of law enforcement interactions. There was some chat about why these individuals were not present today. And the reason is that we were concerned about re-traumatizing those with lived experience when talking about and interpreting police data. You will all receive an email, as Petra said, about part 2 in the next few weeks. We hope you learn more about what policing looks like in San Mateo and San Mateo County. We do have some local challenges and some bias in law enforcement, as with other institutions. As Petra mentioned, it would be unrealistic if we didn't. Here are 3 action items as you process this information, think about the institutional impact, and consider what we can do collectively. First, envision. Spend some time thinking about the community you want to live in. It is hard to know how to get somewhere if we don't know where we are going. Second, discuss, be informed, and work together. This group was over 170 people, and we all have friends, families, and connections. The more we discuss and familiarize ourselves with the issues of public safety and law enforcement, the less intimidating it gets. This includes our elected officials. Get to know them and discuss these issues with them. Imagine if this group called our electeds this week to discuss. And for those electeds on the call, thank you for your service and for taking our phone calls. Some potential questions to ask your electeds or those who are running for office. How do you represent those in your community that don't look like you, speak your language, or in a different income bracket? And how do you support their health, safety, and well-being? And thirdly, vote and encourage others to vote. Thank you all for your partnership today. I look forward to seeing everyone for part 2 of this event, and have a wonderful afternoon.